Welcome to the video lecture where we'll be discussing multiculturalism in terms of the curriculum and teaching practices. This lecture will cover two readings: Embracing Change, Teaching in a Multicultural World by Bell Hooks, and Banks' 5 Dimensions and Strategies for Early Childhood Programs by Ogletree and Lark. First, we're going to talk about what it means to teach in a multicultural world by looking at Bell Hooks' article. While we discuss Bell Hooks' ideas, keep in mind the following questions. How do you create an inclusive classroom? That is, how do you create a classroom where all people are represented and participating, where all realities are being heard, witnessed, and understood? What pedagogies best align with multiculturalism? That is, if I want to teach in a multicultural way, how must I do this? What are the best approaches available to me? And third, what prevents education from being truly inclusive and multicultural? That is, what is currently the case about classrooms and what is lacking so that I can, as a teacher and educator, prevent this from happening in my classroom. We will then spend some time talking about Banks' dimensions of multicultural education. When we discuss this article, keep the following questions in mind. What is multiculturalism according to Banks? How does Banks think that this should look like in education? What are these 5 dimensions that he's talking about? And most importantly, if we want to teach for a multicultural world in a multicultural educational setting, why bother? What's the value of this type of education? Before we get into the articles and ideas of these authors, let's learn a little bit about who they are as people. Let's start with Bell Hooks. It is important for you to note that Bell Hooks purposefully does not capitalize her first or last name. So when writing about Bell Hooks, make sure that you do not capitalize the B or the H. She uses the decapitalization of her name as a resistance to a particular way, a white, male-dominated way of writing. And she uses this as a way of resisting the power structure of what is considered appropriate, and therefore decides to decapitalize her name. She also says that she wants to decapitalize her name because she wants you to focus on her writing and not her name. It's less important for you to remember who she is, she says, than it is to remember what she's saying and to take it seriously. Additionally, Bell Hooks is not her original name. She was born with the name Goya Jean Watkins and later takes up the pen name Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks is a current-day African-American professor who focuses on the areas of feminism and social activism in education. Much of what she talks about comes from her own experiences in public schools during the time of segregation in the South. She was part of the experience of being segregated because of the color of her skin, and then being one of the pioneers of going to pursue a higher education when racism and segregation and white supremacy still existed. She got her college degree from Stanford University, Wisconsin-Madison, and the University of California. Over the many years, she has written more than 30 books. The one that's most notably for this class, if you're interested in learning more about her ideas, is to look at the book Teaching to Transgress: Education as a Practice of Freedom. As she mentions in the article, and as you may realize as you're reading the article yourself, Bell Hooks is greatly inspired and informed by the ideas of Paulo Freire that we've learned about before. Keep this in mind as you see connections between her ideas and what Paulo Freire says in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Bell Hooks currently teaches in her home state of Kentucky at Bevia College, though in the past she taught at the University of California, Yale University, Oberlin College, which is the focus of the article that we read today, as well as the City College of New York. James Banks is also an African-American educator and professor. and is recognized as one of the main pioneers of the idea of a multicultural education within the United States. Most notably, he is the founding director of the University of Washington Center for Multicultural Education, where he currently still works, the age of 77. He has a college degree from Chicago's Teachers College and from Michigan State University. He is also a widely published author. The one book that most connects to what we're learning about today, if you are interested in learning more about his ideas, is Educating Citizens in a Multicultural Society. He has served in many leadership positions throughout his whole life. Most notably, he has been the past president of the AERA and the National Council for Social Sciences. Okay, so now let's look at some of the key terms that come up in the readings to make sure we're all on the same page before we discuss the ideas of each author's. First, the term multiculturalism. Bell Hooks and James Banks may have slightly different definitions of multiculturalism, but in general, multiculturalism in the sphere of education means the representation of the many cultures and a serious consideration of what these cultures can do to enrich the learning and teaching process. This includes, as we will see as we examine Banks's idea of the 5 dimensions, both the integration of multicultural identities and realities in the content, but also the informing of multicultural realities in how teachers teach and how classrooms and schools are structured. Inclusiveness, namely for bell hooks, means that we honor and respect the reality and experiences of non-white groups. So here, inclusiveness is focused on those that have been in the minority, that have experienced oppression. And the focus is not on whites because they are the ones that are generally represented and influencing the educational curriculum and experience. So inclusiveness is focusing on those populations that have been marginalized, been invisible by the school structure. Critical pedagogy and transformative pedagogy are 2 approaches for teaching that we'll look about more in depth in a little bit. Critical consciousness for bell hooks, if we look at page 658 where she brings it up, is a concept that she's bringing in from Paulo Freire. And essentially, being critically conscious means that you have the ability to see systems of inequality and then evaluate those systems of inequality and then do something about the systems of inequality. So you're aware of injustices and you know how to challenge them and overcome them. Bell Hooks also discusses the idea of safe space in her article about teaching in a multicultural world, and within this she talks about how safe space are sometimes understood as being places where students feel like they can avoid having to discuss issues that are offensive. So this is the idea of safe space as being a censored space where no one is allowed to offend anyone. Safe space can also mean a space where people can voice their ideas openly without censoring themselves, and that no one should be taking offense to the expression of each individual's opinions or ideas or experiences. Safe spaces can also mean, and this is what it means specifically for bell hooks, is a place where there is a sense of community, a shared goal and a commitment to do something such as learning. And within that space, all participants are participating in understanding and in that shared goal, maybe that's learning, and that there are strategies within that space to work through conflicts and possibilities of being offended and challenging power structures. And lastly, safe space can also mean like literally the separate spaces for marginalized groups to talk with members of their own groups about the challenges that they're facing in society. So these are seen as safe spaces, as refuge spaces. such as like a club for the LGBTQ community or an African American club, where safe space is literally the segregation of groups in order to allow groups to talk openly about their experiences of being oppressed or harmed by other groups. And lastly, the idea of tokenism and native informant. This is the idea brought up in bell hooks where we bring in multicultural realities by tokenizing them, so making them seem shiny and special and not having them being enriched and meaningful, but we just plop them in to, check the box off of multiculturalism. And also native informant is when we rely on individuals in a particular setting, so for bell hooks in an educational setting, to attest to their experiences as a representation of the community in which they belong. So the idea that we point out an African American student and ask them to share what it means to them, as we're placing this responsibility of them being an expert and to explain their culture and their group's experiences. And bell hooks talks about how this is problematic and bad because we are objectifying the person. So now let's look at the different pedagogies that bell hooks talks about in her article. And this will be important when we think about what it means to teach in a multicultural world and what it means to teach on multiculturalism. So for some people, teaching multiculturalism, and perhaps this is what part of Banks's 5 dimensions are looking at, is that you're just trying to promote awareness, that there isn't a political aim in talking about different cultures and making sure students understand that different cultures exist and that they're tolerant of each other's cultures. There are other pedagogies that take this idea of power and try to use education as a way to affect change in society, to change individuals, to be more justice oriented, and to create society where power is not unequal and where injustices are challenged. And this type of teaching either fits in the realm of critical pedagogy or in the realm of transformative pedagogy. And these are two terms that bell hooks uses interchangeably in her article. So while these words or ways of teaching are often seen as synonyms, as being the same, there are some distinct differences. Namely, that critical pedagogy is focused on group awareness and resistance to injustice, where transformative pedagogy in some spheres is really focused on the individual, changing themselves so that they can be a change agent in society. So it's more personal focus, and transformative pedagogy has a very explicit bent towards social activism, where critical pedagogy is focused more on general awareness and critical awareness of social issues. So as we've learned before, Paulo Freire was really the leading founder of the critical pedagogy movement, and this idea that teaching is inherently a political act and that there is always a hidden curriculum, there are always power structures, and that as teachers we need to help prevent the further disempowering of groups of people and provide opportunities for those groups through education to realize their own power and ability to fight the injustices that they face in society. So within the critical pedagogy movement, the general goal is for students to become aware of the structures of power that oppress them or that they're benefiting from in order to resist them. So in order to prevent themselves from participating in these unjust power structures, and for ways for them to rise up and challenge those power structures if they are being marginalized by them. And to do that, we work through trying to wake students up to realizing that there is human suffering in the world and that people all are oppressed, to get them to care about this issue. And after we do that, the goal is then to prepare students to fight against these injustices and oppressions together as a community, as allies. The approaches for how we do this in a critical pedagogy is, one, teachers need to help students learn about oppression and suffering, and then unlearn those biases and stereotypes and ways of being in the world that perpetuate those systems of oppression, those problematic power structures. And we do that by teaching students about these issues. We raise their awareness. And then once students are aware of these issues, we have to help them be able to see these issues on their own without our help and criticize these realities so that they can then act. So we do this by focusing on students' ability to be critical thinkers and have a lot of social literacy and critical literacy techniques. And lastly, after students are aware of the issues and have the ability to see them with a critical eye and examine them, we promote and encourage students to reflect on how they are participating, benefiting or not benefiting from these realities, and then move them to think about how they're going to act for change. So within the classroom community, this might look something like teaching students about critical literacy, or allowing students to engage in dialogue with one another, sharing their experiences, or critically analyzing a situation in conversation with others. And this could also look like the creation of service learning projects, community-based learning projects, or actions projects that are related to issues that the students see in their current realities or context. There is also a large developing curriculum in the different subjects that are focused on critical pedagogy. For example, there's a 2013 text called Rethinking Math, where math is connected to social problems. So students are learning to analyze social problems by using math, which allows them to be aware of these social problems and criticize them using mathematical techniques and knowledge. And then there are action projects associated with these math problems around understanding social problems in those students' contexts. Okay, so critical pedagogy is this idea, again, right, that teaching is a political act, and we need to do it in a way that empowers people to improve their lived situations and challenge hierarchies of power. Now, transformative pedagogy has similar aims, but does it by looking at the individual. So it's focused on critical self-reflection for a person to become a better person, being more justice-oriented, so that they then can become better activists and allies in their communities to fight for issues of social justice. Transformative here means the ability to change. So our focus is on changing ourselves and then changing our world or our communities. So the sub-goals of transformative pedagogy is to help develop students' critical self-awareness. So they're aware of their own selves, but start to challenge things that they've taken for granted, perhaps their beliefs, their values, their ways of knowing or operating in the world. Another goal is then, after a student develops their own critical self-awareness, we get students to gain an appreciation for multiculturalism. That is, that they realize that there are different perspectives and ways of living in the world, and they come to embrace this and to see this as a good thing, to be tolerant of it. The method of doing this is very focused on the individual students. So we work on helping each student examine their personal beliefs, their own values, and their own knowledge. And then we work on helping students develop an understanding of multiculturalism, that is, the ideas of other cultures and the experiences of other people. And then we create an environment where students can construct new understandings of the world with other people. So transformative pedagogy takes these ideas of critical pedagogy and then also adds this idea of constructivist learning, where knowledge is constructed by the group and needs to be constructed with others and is not something that's passed down by the experts. So once students learn and develop a new knowledge of the world by being in conversation with others, by learning about other people's lived experiences, They also then learn explicitly about social justice and activism, because again, the idea here is that we transform ourselves and then we need to use that to transform the world, and we need models for how to do that. So transformative pedagogy is very focused on the social justice element. And then the last step for implementing transformative pedagogy in the classroom would be to encourage students to participate in improving the contexts where they are in, so action projects, similar to the action projects of critical pedagogy. So when we are thinking about bell hooks and her ideas of teaching in a multicultural world, we need to remember that she is coming from a very Paulo Freire's perspective, right, of the fact that we should not have a banking system of education where teachers have all the knowledge and they impart it on their students who are empty vessels to receive that knowledge, but instead that education should be a political act where we challenge the power structures, where the teachers become the students and the students become the teachers. And we also have to remember that bell hooks is advocating for a very political type of pedagogy, that is a critical pedagogy and a transformative pedagogy, where her goal is that in a multicultural world, students need to be aware of how different cultures are experiencing the world, are understanding the world, and understanding how all of these things create problematic power structures and injustices, so that teachers can create more inclusive classrooms, but also so that students can be better change agents in the world and communities that they exist in. Let's look at another approach to teaching multicultural education that is discussed in the reading Banks's 5 Dimensions and Strategies for Early Childhood Programs. So Banks comes up with 5 different elements of what makes for a truly multicultural educational experience. And the article that we read today focuses on early childhood, so preschool and kindergarten. But note that Banks's 5 dimensions apply to all levels of education. And so he says that in order for an education to truly be multicultural, it has to have some curriculum that's multicultural. It has to work on seeing knowledge as something that's multicultural. It needs to create spaces where prejudice cannot exist and that it's reduced. It needs to include teaching techniques that bring up all students to be successful. And it also needs to be part of a larger school and classroom cultural reform that empowers all people in the community. So let's first look at curriculum content. So here Banks says, quote, "This is how teachers use examples, data, and information from diverse cultures to support key concepts, principles, generalizations, and theories." So essentially, this is the idea of including diverse materials into the classroom. This can be, as cited in the reading on the first page, the use of dolls that come in different colors, of multicultural crayons. This can also mean the integration of diverse authors. So within a early childhood program, this would be photographs and picture books that are written by diverse authors, but also represent diversity in the types of people that they are representing. And this also means focusing on a diversity of topics. So when talking about a particular idea, that you bring in how diverse cultures would talk about or think about these issues. So if we think about community, we could talk about how community is understood in different cultures. And this is connected to the idea of knowledge construction. So here the idea is knowledge, the way we understand things, can be informed by others. And so we can't just know something by only looking at it from our individual perspective. We need to understand it from all perspectives. And then to do so in a multicultural classroom is to understand how different cultures learn things or know things, or how different cultures can influence what we can understand about a particular topic or way or example. So in knowledge construction, quote, "Teachers assist the students in comprehending how knowledge is produced and influenced by racial, social, and ethnic and social cultures." So this can be done on 4 different levels, and we can think about like which levels bell hooks would really be supportive of. And the 4 approaches that Banks talks about is contribution, additive, transformation, and social action. So contribution is where you fold in the idea of different ways of understanding things in holiday celebrations, or History Month, where you have Black History Month and Women's History Month, where you bring in multiculturalism as an add-on to contribute to how we already understand things. So a student may already understand their own holiday, and then you bring in the idea of other holidays to help enrich their understandings of holidays and celebrations across cultures. This is an idea or approach that Bell Hooks is a little resistant to. Unless the content is really meaningfully integrated, she fears that this idea of contributions, this tag-on approach to multiculturalism, promotes this tokenism or the native informant, where the different cultures are not given equal weight, that they're seen as just like the side note, or they're seen as a way of promoting inclusivity, but don't really actually make students feel equally part of the school culture, or equally having their experiences or cultures represented in the school. So, for example, many people believe that Black History Month shouldn't just be one Black History Month, because all of the Black history is then focused on that one month and is the topic of one month, but then the rest of the school year, Black history is kind of ignored. So this idea that you're tokenizing, you're not really meaningfully integrating the lived experiences of African American people throughout the school year. And then the second approach is the additive approach, which is an approach that I think Bell Hooks would be a little more supportive of. So you bring in different multicultural examples, concepts, themes, and perspectives and stories into the curriculum. And so you use diverse examples throughout the school day. Transformational knowledge construction under Banks's concept is the idea that you help students understand multiculturalism by having them work in sharing their own personal stories and lived experiences, while also promoting this idea of inclusiveness by creating opportunities for students to share their stories and discuss injustice and justice and anti-bias work, but also telling stories or having lessons around, social justice and anti-bias and stereotypes. So the idea here is that you transform the individual's understanding by having them be witness and hearing other people's lived realities, and this would then help transform society. So this is definitely something that Bell Hooks would be a fan of, because it's definitely connected to this idea of transformative pedagogy. And then the fourth step of helping create knowledge construction in a multicultural classroom is the integration of social action within the classroom. And this is the idea that you encourage students to take on action projects around multicultural identities. So it might be that students realize that there is, some stereotypes happening in their school, they propose a solution and then advocate for that solution. Or maybe students realize, that there's some racism that's happening in their community, and so they help organize and participate in a rally or a march. Here we can see the social action approach to knowledge construction, this idea that we share our lived experiences to come up with a new and better way of understanding the world, and then try to help others see the world as we see it, as being very aligned with both the transformative pedagogy and the critical pedagogy work that Bell Hooks is a proponent of. So in summary, Bell Hooks would agree with Banks's idea that knowledge construction is an important part of a multicultural education, though she focuses mainly on the additive approach, the transformational approach, and the social action approach. So then there's the work of actively working to reduce prejudice in the teachers, in the students, and in the school community. So in order to create a truly inclusive classroom, a truly inclusive school, and a school that is promoting multiculturalism, this idea of tolerance and respect for diversity, the administration and teachers need to work on decreasing racial stereotypes, class stereotypes, cultural stereotypes, and prejudices in the school. So this would look like for Banks, having teachers take some training, maybe training that is similar to what Bell Hooks is promoting, or even some just simple anti-bias training, or anti-bullying training. And then the school needs to create some strategies for preventing prejudice from happening in the first place. So this is a very proactive approach. And then it also needs to have policies to react to stereotypes and prejudice and racism and bullying that occur in the classroom or in the school. So strategies for addressing prejudice when they do crop up and how to address them immediately. And then prejudice reduction can also be encouraging teachers and administrations and staff to use language that is inclusive, that promotes tolerance and respect. So using language such as everyone instead of boys and girls, and creating classroom environments where you might not sort students based on their gender or their race, but create environments where you're sorting students to help promote diversity in smaller groups. And then there's the need to create different techniques or strategies that teachers can use to implement multiculturalism ideals, this idea of tolerance within the classroom. And essentially here, the idea is by focusing on equity over equality. So equity is the idea of giving every student what they need in order to be successful, and recognizing that if you give every student equal things, that they might not all be equally successful because students' needs differ based on individuals. And this can also be generalized to larger societal groups. So different groups of people have had different experiences in the world that have created barriers to success, and other communities have had, very helpful experiences in the world that have eliminated barriers. And so it wouldn't be fair to give all groups equal things because some groups experience more barriers than others. Instead, we need to help address the barriers for the groups that have those barriers to bring them up to the level of those groups that do not have the barriers in being successful. And so within a teaching and educational environment, this means that a teacher needs to be aware of what their individual students' needs are and how they relate to the social dynamics, cultural and racial dynamics within the larger society, and then use the appropriate teaching techniques in order to address each of those students' needs, so that there aren't certain populations of students that are being successful and certain populations of students that are falling behind in the classroom. And lastly, Banks thinks that the only way for a true education to be multicultural is if the entire school and classroom community is embracing the values of multiculturalism. So this means that we have to empower the school to create a sense of community that brings up everyone and recognizes everyone's differences and does so in a respectful way. So this couldn't be done by encouraging different types of participation in school activities, whether in the classroom or in after-school clubs. So looking at who's participating in what and working on how to make that more equitable. It can also mean that you work on how your staff and teachers interact with one another, so that, if you're seeing some gender dynamics or racial dynamics crop up within your school staff, that you address them in order to create a culture where everyone, all staff, feels empowered, represented, and heard. This can also mean including and developing inclusive school policies that promote a sense of culture and school community. And this can also mean having opportunities and strategies for engaging all families into the school. So looking at who's participating in school events, what families are not being brought in, what families don't look like they're being included or that don't feel welcome, and create a classroom culture, a school culture that encourages all families to be active participants in the education of their children. Leave the lecture with some lingering questions for you to continue thinking about. The first is whether or not we should be teaching multiculturalism at all. The second is, if we think that multiculturalism in education is important, what should it look like? Should we only focus on changing our curriculum? Should we focus on changing how teachers teach? Should we work on creating different and more inclusive structures within the classroom and the larger school? Should we be focusing on building relationships between teachers and students and teachers and families and schools? Should we be focusing on all of them? And if we're going to focus on them, like, which way should we be approaching it? Is Banks's idea better than Bell Hooks's idea? And lastly, should how we teach multiculturalism depend on the age of the students? That is, should it look different for different ages? Should it look different for different types of schools? So should multiculturalism look different in a public school than in a private school, or in an urban school, or in a rural school? Should it be different based on who the students are and who the teachers are?